Enterprise AI usually does not break when the first idea is proposed. It breaks later when security, legal, and governance finally step in. That matters to you because late governance creates rework, delays rollout, damages trust, and turns promising projects into internal liabilities. In this video, I will show you why governance has to be treated as part of solution design, not paperwork after the real work. You will see how bounded risk use cases, stage gates, and early approval rules make enterprise AI easier to scale, not harder. Part 1. AI enthusiasm moves faster than governance because governance feels slower and less exciting. Most organizations move faster on AI ideas than they move on governance. That is not hard to understand. AI feels innovative, visible, and potentially valuable. Governance feels slower, more political, and less exciting. Teams want to prototype. Leaders want momentum. Vendors are pushing capability stories. Internal champions want to prove something useful quickly. Under those conditions, governance often gets treated as a later problem. The trouble is that enterprise AI does not stay in the idea stage for long. Even a small proof of concept can trigger attention from executives, operations, security, legal, compliance, and infrastructure teams once people think it might spread. At that point, the project is no longer just a technical curiosity. It becomes a business capability with risk, accountability, and organizational consequences. If governance was not part of the early thinking, the team suddenly has to retrofit controls into a direction that may already be politically committed. That is where enthusiasm outruns governance. The solution direction starts hardening before the organization has decided what risk is acceptable, where human review belongs, what evidence is needed, or who is responsible when something goes wrong. The faster the early excitement, the more painful that correction becomes later. This is why governance cannot be treated as the enemy of innovation. In enterprise settings, governance is part of how innovation becomes real. Without it, the project may look fast at the start, but become slower and more fragile when approvals, audits, support questions, or executive concerns show up. What looked like speed was often just deferred friction. Teams should not ask only, "Can we build this?" They should also ask, "What happens when people want to rely on it?" That question changes the conversation in a healthy way. It moves the work from demo excitement toward responsible adoption. And that transition needs to happen earlier than most teams expect. Part 2. The common mistake is bringing in security and legal after the solution direction is already chosen. One of the most damaging governance mistakes in enterprise AI is waiting too long to involve security and legal. Teams begin with a use case, prototype a solution, prove that the model can do something useful, and start building internal enthusiasm. Then, once the direction feels real, security and legal get invited into the conversation. At that point, they are not being asked to help shape the design, they are being asked to react to a path that already feels chosen. That creates predictable tension. Security sees risks that were not designed around. Legal sees exposure that was not bounded clearly enough. Compliance concerns show up late when the team is already emotionally invested in the solution. The result is that governance feels like a blocker, even though the deeper problem is sequencing. The wrong people were brought in too late after architectural and workflow assumptions had already started to harden. When governance arrives after the solution direction is chosen, governance becomes rework. That is expensive technically, politically, and organizationally. Teams may have to change data handling, alter review paths, restrict release scope, add auditability, or redefine user expectations. None of those are small corrections if the project has already been framed as almost ready. Security and legal are most useful when they act as design inputs, not final gatekeepers. They help identify where risk enters the workflow, what should be bounded, what must be visible, where approvals are required, and what forms of evidence will matter later. That early participation usually improves design quality. It prevents teams from building in ways that create avoidable resistance downstream. A better pattern is to involve governance roles when the use case is still being shaped. Not when every detail is finalized, but when the team is still deciding what kind of solution this should be, what data it should touch, how much autonomy it should have, and what failure conditions matter most. That keeps governance from becoming adversarial. In mature enterprise environments, the question is not whether security and legal will eventually matter, they always will. The real question is whether they are invited early enough to help the project succeed, instead of being blamed later for slowing down a direction they never had a fair chance to shape. Part 3. Start with bounded risk use cases that are easier to govern and defend. One of the smartest ways to reduce governance friction in enterprise AI is to start with bounded risk use cases. Not every valuable AI opportunity has to begin with high sensitivity, broad autonomy, or organization-wide consequences. In fact, many teams get better traction by choosing use cases that are useful, measurable, and easier to control. That gives the organization a safer way to learn while building confidence across roles. A bounded risk use case usually has 4 characteristics. First, clear ownership. Someone on the business side and someone on the technical side are responsible for the process and the solution. Second, reversible outcomes. If something goes wrong, the effect can be corrected without major damage. Third, limited sensitivity. The data, workflow, or output does not create unnecessary exposure. Fourth, measurable business gain. The use case solves a real problem in a way that can be observed and defended. Those traits do not eliminate risk, but they make it more manageable. Bounded risk is not the same thing as trivial value. That is an important distinction. A use case can still produce meaningful efficiency, consistency, or quality improvement while remaining narrow enough to govern responsibly. In many enterprises, that is exactly the right place to begin. Starting with bounded risk work also improves internal politics. Executives see progress without feeling that the organization is gambling recklessly. Security and legal teams see that risk is being taken seriously. Project managers gain a more realistic scope. Technical teams are less likely to be pushed into impossible promises. All of that matters because trust is not built only from technical success. It is built from controlled success. When evaluating early AI candidates, ask a practical set of questions. Is ownership clear? Can errors be reviewed and corrected? Is the release scope narrow enough to control? Is the data sensitivity appropriate for an early effort? Can the business gain be measured in plain language? If the answer is yes, the organization may have a much stronger starting point than a flashy but risky use case. Enterprises usually do not lose trust because they started too small. They lose trust because they moved too broadly before proving disciplined control. Bounded risk use cases give teams a better way to earn credibility before larger ambitions enter the picture. Part 4. Good governance speeds delivery by reducing rework and increasing confidence. Many people talk about governance as though it exists mainly to slow things down. That is understandable because governance often shows up as review meetings, approvals, restrictions, and hard questions. But the contrarian truth is that good governance is actually a speed tool. It speeds delivery by reducing late rework, clarifying expectations, and increasing confidence among the people who have to approve, support, and defend the system. Without governance, teams often move quickly at first and then hit resistance later. Security raises concerns. Legal asks for changes. Executives become uncertain about risk. project managers discover missing review paths. Infrastructure teams realize the support model is vague. Those late-stage corrections slow the project far more than early governance would have. So what looked like speed was often just unstructured forward motion. Good governance accelerates responsible progress because it creates cleaner decision-making. It tells the team what boundaries matter, what evidence is needed, where human review belongs, and what conditions must be satisfied before wider rollout. That reduces ambiguity, and reducing ambiguity is one of the fastest ways to improve delivery quality. Governance also helps executives. Leaders do not just want promising capabilities, they want capabilities they can explain, justify, and defend. When governance is present early, leaders gain more confidence that the work is being handled responsibly. That confidence matters because executive hesitation often comes less from fear of AI itself and more from fear of weak control around AI. Teams should stop framing governance as paperwork after innovation. It is part of the operating structure that makes innovation scalable. A project with defined risk boundaries, approval expectations, auditability, and review paths will usually move through the organization with less friction than a project that looks exciting but vague. Governance makes it easier for people to say yes, because the conditions for yes are clearer. In enterprise environments, speed is not just about how fast a team can build. It is about how fast the organization can trust what was built. That is why governance deserves a different reputation. Done well, it is not a break. It is one of the main reasons responsible AI adoption can move faster. Part 5. Stage gates and guardrails should exist before broader AI rollout begins. One of the most effective ways to operationalize governance is to define stage gates and guardrails before broader rollout begins. This does not require a giant governance bureaucracy. It requires explicit thresholds that tell the organization what must be true before the solution moves into a wider level of use. That creates structure around progression instead of relying on enthusiasm and informal judgment. A stage gate is a decision point. A guardrail is a condition or limit that shapes how the system can operate. Together, they help turn AI delivery into a managed progression instead of a vague escalation of commitment. Useful thresholds often include acceptable risk, required human review, auditability, escalation paths, and release scope. For example, a solution may be allowed in a narrow internal pilot only if human review remains mandatory. A broader rollout may require stronger audit trails, clearer ownership, and defined escalation for questionable output. The purpose of stage gates is not to create ceremony. It is to prevent teams from quietly sliding from experiment to real dependence without proving the conditions that justify that transition. That is especially important in AI because adoption pressure can increase quickly once users see something that feels helpful. Guardrails also help different roles work together more effectively. Project managers gain clearer progression rules. Security and legal gain defined review points instead of last-minute surprises. Executives gain a more transparent way to understand how risk is being managed over time. Technical teams gain clearer boundaries for design and release. That shared structure reduces the chance that one group thinks the system is still experimental, while another group is already treating it as operational. Start simple. Define what is allowed at prototype stage, what must become true for controlled operational use, and what additional evidence is required for broader deployment. Make the thresholds visible. Make ownership explicit. Make escalation real. Those steps create a much stronger delivery environment than relying on optimism and hallway agreement. Enterprise AI scales more cleanly when progression is earned in stages. Stage gates and guardrails do not weaken innovation. They give innovation a construction order. and in complex organizations, construction order is what prevents momentum from turning into disorder. Part 6. Unsupported AI systems become political liabilities once trust starts to break. One of the most underappreciated risks in enterprise AI is that unsupported systems quickly become political liabilities. At first, a project may look promising. Users see value, leaders hear positive feedback, the team feels momentum. But if the system begins producing questionable behavior without clear support, visibility, or review, trust can erode fast. Once that happens, the conversation shifts from capability to blame. Political liability emerges when people no longer believe the organization is in control of the system. Maybe no one is clearly accountable. Maybe the review path is vague. Maybe the output is inconsistent and nobody can explain why. Maybe the system spread further than expected. Maybe legal or security concerns were left unresolved. These issues are not just technical weaknesses. They become organizational weaknesses because they affect confidence, sponsorship, and willingness to continue investing. Once trust breaks, the cost is larger than one failed tool. The whole AI initiative can become harder to defend internally. Future proposals face more skepticism. Governance gets tighter in reactive ways. Executives become more cautious. Teams that were not involved in the original problem become less willing to support the next effort. That is why unsupported systems are dangerous. They damage the credibility of the broader program. This is especially true in enterprises where multiple groups must cooperate to make AI successful. Infrastructure, security, legal, project management, operations, and technical teams all need enough confidence that the system is bounded, reviewable, and supportable. If those conditions are weak, the project stops looking like a disciplined capability and starts looking like an unmanaged risk. The practical lesson is straightforward. Do not let AI systems become informally relied upon without explicit support expectations. Define ownership. Define review procedures. Define escalation. Define what happens when confidence is low, behavior changes, or a user challenge arises. Those operational details protect the project politically because they show that the organization is taking responsibility seriously. Enterprise AI does not need to be perfect to survive, but it does need to be governable, supportable, and defensible. When those conditions are missing, even useful systems can become liabilities, and that can poison the environment for everything that comes next. Part 7. Define review and approval rules early so growth does not outpace control. The most practical next step for many organizations is to define review and approval rules early, before the pilot spreads and before expectations harden. That means deciding who must sign off, what evidence is required, and when escalation is mandatory. These rules do not have to be heavy. They do have to be explicit. Start with the basic approval structure. Who approves the use case from the business side? Who represents technical ownership? When must security review the design? When does legal need to be involved? What kinds of data, workflow actions, or user-facing behavior trigger deeper review? What evidence should exist before the project is allowed into broader use? Those questions sound simple, but they create a shared operating model for governance. Without that model, teams end up improvising under pressure. Approval rules are valuable because they reduce ambiguity before momentum turns into entitlement. Once people start treating a pilot as though it obviously deserves expansion, it becomes much harder to reintroduce discipline. Early approval rules keep the conversation grounded in conditions rather than excitement alone. Review rules should also define escalation. What happens if a system behaves unexpectedly? What happens if output affects a sensitive decision? What happens if users begin relying on a feature beyond its intended scope? What happens if a risk question cannot be resolved cleanly? These are not edge concerns. They are part of what makes enterprise AI sustainable. Keep the structure practical. Use a simple approval map. Make the required evidence visible. Identify named decision makers. Clarify what can move fast and what cannot. The goal is not to create bureaucracy for its own sake. The goal is to make growth controllable so the organization can expand AI use with more confidence and less political friction. Mature enterprises do not wait for conflict to force governance into place. They define the review and approval structure early enough that the project can grow inside clear boundaries. That is one of the simplest and strongest ways to turn AI from an exciting experiment into a capability the organization is willing to stand behind. Enterprise AI breaks when governance arrives after trust, risk, and rollout expectations have already become harder to control. The organizations that scale AI best will treat governance as part of design, not as cleanup after the fact. Explore more of my work at ain.net.com. Thanks for watching.